What is nothing?
What is nothing? I don't feel there is any such thing as nothing, to be honest.
So God always was.
If you just hold the mic
sorry.
up.
So God always was and always will be?
Well, what I know about God is very limited to what I know about, in comparison to what I know about God's creation. And the reason why that is God existed before creation exists. And as a result, there are certain things I know about God's personality and nature, quite a lot, in fact, about those things, because as you receive more and more of God's love, you come to know more and more of God's character and nature. But in terms of how God got created or came into existence, I don't feel those kind of questions can be very easily answered at all. And in fact, I've been examining those kind of questions for 2,000 years now, and I still don't have answers for many of them. The reason why, I actually feel like it's highly likely I will never find the answers to some of those questions. Because to know the answers to some questions, you would have to actually be God yourself. And I know that I'm not God. I know for certain that I'll never be God, and I'll never become one with God in all ways, because God is an infinite being as far as I'm aware. There seems to be an infinite capacity of love that I can receive from God. So, and it also, every single person who's ever asked for love from God has received it, and there are many of my friends, particularly in the spirit world, who have received immense amounts of that love, and yet there still seems to be more that you can receive. So from our perspective, God is an infinite being, and being an infinite being and us being a finite being, it's going to be very difficult for us to understand some of the questions that we try or attempt to ask about God. I feel the more important question is, how do you experience God? So oftentimes what we do is we focus on questions that don't necessarily or can never really have a complete answer, and then we neglect questions where we can answer everything. And I feel there's reasons why we do that emotionally. That we ask certain questions, and then don't ask sometimes questions that have more of an impact on our day-to-day life. So from my perspective, if you could draw a scale, obviously infinite is far beyond our capacity to understand generally from a soul perspective, and also from an intellectual perspective. So if we could say this is infinite, which is impossible, of course, because there's no such thing as a scale of infinity, but let's say that's infinity, we basically are right down here. And then even, I feel the most developed person in the universe, like the most developed beings in the universe that have received God's love into, to become at one with God, and then eventually they become at one with their other half of their soul, and that's called a soul union state. I feel that they've only grown that much in comparison to what they could grow. Does that make sense? And I feel there's still all of this growth that could occur and will occur if we still continue to receive God's love. And by the way, God's love might not be the only thing that we can receive from God. So at the moment, many of us have received God's love, but there may be other things such as knowledge and wisdom and other things that are part of God's nature that we're not even aware of at this point. And to become aware of it, we'd have to receive love to this point to become aware that we could receive other things. Does that make sense? So I feel asking questions about God, very important to ask. But in particular, it's very important to ask more about God's nature and character than it is about God's or whether God was created or not created and so forth. Because some of those answers I don't think will ever be able to be answered by a human soul from an experience perspective. So we could postulate a lot of theories, but at the end of the day, theories don't benefit us. They're just ideas, so I've got hundreds of them, but you don't want to hear theories about where God came from and all those kind of things. At the end of the day, we want to find out what the facts are. But there are certain things about God's nature that we know for certain are true. For example, I know for certain that God is a God of love and never a God of anger or rage. And if you think about just that one piece of knowledge, what effect it would have on the world's religions. Because most of the people in the world's religions believe that God does have rage. In fact, the Bible The Christian holy book, the Bible, says that God does. And the Quran says that God does. So most of these books say that God has rage even. Now, this belief that God has rage is a defamation, right? Defaming God's character. Because the reality is it doesn't exist in God. And if you know that one thing about God's personality, that changes your perspective of a lot of things in life, right down to, ooh. Does that mean your power has just gone down a few volts, does it? All of a sudden the lights just dimmed. Did you notice that? Yeah. So when it comes to God's character and nature, I feel that these are the most important questions that we can ask about God. And this one thing about God, that God is only loving, is such an important thing to understand from a soul-based perspective. And it would change most belief systems on the planet if we all understood that. Like, you would have to throw out most Christian belief systems based upon punishment and those kind of systems. You'd have to throw out most Muslim-based systems based upon punishment. That'd all be gone. You would also, if you were bringing your life into harmony with it, you'd have to treat your children differently. You'd have to treat each other differently, just by bringing your life into harmony with that one concept. And I feel that these are the important things that are going to change the world we live in. Yeah. But it is an interesting question. Where does God come from? And what's God's nature in terms of soul-based nature? But you're only going to understand that by getting closer to God each time, and therefore having the capacity to understand. I often liken it to a man who makes a vehicle. You can make the vehicle, but the vehicle doesn't understand its maker. But the maker understands the vehicle. And it's very much the same with God. God made us. We might begin to understand some of God's nature, but God understands all of our nature. God understands everything about us. But it's probably going to be physically impossible for us to understand everything about God. Because if we did, we would be God.